To Black Country Memories evening. There'll be 3 chairs this evening because we're all presenting, and so we're having to jump and juggle, and hopefully it all goes smooth. Welcome to what is our final virtual meeting of the Black Country Society. We've got a varied programme and some fascinating titles, a variety to say the least. We have the chat box open. If you're not familiar with it, if you go to the chat button on the bottom of your screen, you can type in anything you want to share with everybody else. We're using it this evening in 2 ways. One of which is as each speaker finishes their talk, if you've got a question that you want to ask them, type it in at any time, and then one of the chairs will pick it up and pose it to the speaker. But also, if you came along this evening, you haven't let Chris Baker know that you've got something you'd like to share, if you put a note in the chat, we'll try and pick that up later in the programme. All said, we will start our potpourri with Andrew Homer's talk, which is a fascinating combination of names and words. But we've got chain makers, we've got anchor smiths, and the Titanic, and the Carpathia. More of which over to Andrew.
Thanks very much, Ward. Good evening, everyone. Quite a few years ago now, the Grand in Wolverhampton showed for the very first time Titanic the musical. If you haven't seen it, it is actually, well, I found it surprisingly good. But when they were putting it on, they asked for stories in the Express and Star about any local families who'd had any connection whatsoever with the Titanic. And these stories were used in publicity for the show. I sent my story in, they liked it, and I was invited as a VIP guest with 5 or 6 others to the first night showing, and we were treated very well. We had drinks in the VIP lounge before we started. We had the best seats in the house, drinks again in the interval, and it was an absolutely wonderful night and absolutely fantastic. Next slide, please, Chris. Now, the story that I'd told concerned my grandmother and my grandfather on my father's side. Now, I never actually met them. They'd gone before I was old enough to know them. But grandfather was a chain maker and anchor smith from Birch Coppice near Cradley Heath, if anybody doesn't know the area. And he was working before World War One. And as a young man, he was also quite an accomplished dancer and a pretty good boxer. And no doubt he would have visited the Workers' Institute, which is the picture on screen at the moment. Next slide, if you don't mind, Chris. Now, some years ago, I started work at the Black Country Living Museum. Very quickly realised when I was working in the Institute that my grandfather, although I never met him, possibly grandmother as well, had used the Institute. So we'd both been in the same building, but roughly 100 years apart. And the next slide, please, Chris. So, to the family story. So this story had been told to me by my father, who's now long gone, Winston Homer, and it was told to me on a number of occasions, and I'm going to repeat it now as best I can, exactly as it was told to me. I haven't added any embellishments or anything like that. So, family story concerns my grandfather, who apparently met an American lady who invited him to Pennsylvania to help set up a chain making company. And this is before the First World War. Now, my grandfather decided to go, and he agreed to send for my grandmother once he'd got the company in Philadelphia established and he'd got himself settled. So it's early 1912, and he tries to get a third class steerage ticket. If you could show the next slide, Chris. There we go. He tried to get one of these third class steerage tickets for the Titanic. Very fortunately, he couldn't get one. Now, instead, he managed to get passage on a ship leaving Liverpool earlier than the Titanic, still leaving in 1912, but a little bit earlier. Next slide, if you would, Chris. And that ship was the Carpathia. And he got passage, according to the story, on the Carpathia, which left Liverpool. And then it reached New York ahead of the Titanic. And of course, everybody knows the story of the Carpathia rescuing the survivors on its outward journey from New York. My grandfather had arrived safely, of course, and in due course sent for my grandmother, but apparently she refused to go. She would not leave her home in Birch Coppice. The First World War was just about to start, and my father returned shortly before the outbreak of World War One. Now, of course, had he purchased that ticket, third class steerage on the Titanic, he would certainly have perished. So my father would not have been born, and of course, I wouldn't be sitting here telling you the story. Now, that's a story that I've told many times at the Black Country Living Museum. I've told it to schools, groups. We often had groups coming around doing bits and pieces about the Titanic. So it's a story I have related many, many times. And ordinarily, that's where I would leave it, and we'd pass on to the next item for this evening. But it's now not to the end of the story. And this is the first time that I've related this part of it. Many years later, I found myself writing books for Amberley Publishing. And after I'd had one or two published with Amberley, they asked me under contract to do some of their series books. So I did A to Z of Birmingham, A to Z of the Black Country, one or two others for them. And one of the books that they asked me to do was called Secret Black Country. If you could show the slide, Chris, if you wouldn't mind. Here we go. And this particular book had a section on local myths. Now, some of you who attend this regularly will remember me doing some of these with Chris. The title on YouTube, I think, is called A Double Header. We jumped in at the last minute when somebody couldn't do their talk. So I have covered some of these. I'm obviously not going to go through them tonight, but a couple of the stories in there did involve the Titanic. And at the time I was writing it, I thought, oh, it'd be nice to add this little personal anecdote into the book. But this time I wanted to do a bit of research to get dates correct, etc., etc. The research started well because Carpathia had had a scheduled refit and upgrade of a first and second class accommodation early in 1912 in Liverpool, but then it all went sadly wrong. Her normal route was between a place called, very difficult for me to say, Rijeka in Croatia. It's spelt Rijeka, but apparently not pronounced like that, but it's in Croatia. I'll just refer it as Croatia after this point. And her job generally was carrying immigrants from Croatia to New York, and she was regularly on that run. Now, by 1911, companies like Cunard were realizing that their ships could be used for pleasure cruises and not just for taking passengers from A to B, particularly if they're first, second class passengers, there would be in some comfort. And this was the case in 1912. So when Carpathia left Liverpool, it wasn't to go to New York at all, and she certainly wasn't carrying any British immigrants, such as my grandfather. She was carrying 200 wealthy and very wealthy passengers on a pleasure cruise around the Mediterranean for a few weeks, with the plan being to drop them off on another ship to bring them back home. And then the Carpathia itself would then carry, or did then carry on to Croatia, picked up emigrants there, and then made the journey to New York. So my grandfather could not have been aboard the Carpathia. No, a detailed search of passenger records, which are all now online, listed no William Homer born in 1890 ever travelling to America or returning to England on any ship prior to World War One. I also discovered, which it sounds odd, but bear in mind I didn't know them, so I didn't know this. I discovered that William Homer and Alice Harrison, my grandmother's maiden name, they'd only married in October of 1911. So they must have talked about emigrating to America. So why on earth, if they were going to emigrate to America, why wouldn't they have gone together? Why would my grandfather leave his young new bride to travel later on her own? They would have gone together. Anyway, in short, I could find absolutely no evidence at all that my often told and believed family Titanic story ever happened. Thank you.
Ward, could you unmute?
Be useful if I unmuted, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I was saying that research throws up some fascinating twists and turns when you get into it. There are no questions in the chat box. I don't know whether anybody's got a question before we move on. Doesn't look like it.
I think
So
it's
Okay.
I think just to finish off, perhaps it's a bit of a salutary warning about using family history stories as primary research data, unless you've actually followed it up with some real research. Thank you, Ward.
Thank you. Hand over to Chris as we move on down the programme.
Yep, so I'll let you see me now. And we move on through the programme. And there's the programme. So now we're coming on. Keith Bracey is going to talk to us about the life and times of Arthur Merriman, soldier and silversmith. So Keith, could you unmute? And I'll hand over to you. And I'll move on to the next slide. Just tell me when you want to go on to another slide.
Well, firstly, I have a question for Andrew about the Titanic. Well, it's not a question. It's a bit of a piece of information I've garnered over the years. I'm a volunteer at the Smethwick Heritage Centre in Victoria Park, Smethwick, in the lodge there, the Smethwick Victoria Park Lodge next to the War Memorial and the Council House. And we have an apocryphal tale about Avery's, the weighing machine company in Smethwick. Apparently, in 1912, and this there's a book out about on this subject by a chap called Andrew Lound, who folk on this site may know. He's a very extravagant and interesting character who wears a cape and dresses up and does a lot about space and stuff like that. But he tells the story of William Hipkiss, who was the chair of Avery's at the time, going to getting a passage on board the Titanic on April the 12th, 1912, to try and clinch a deal in America with a big weighing machine company in America, whose name escapes me. But this guy was a big cheese at Avery's in Smethwick, who people might know being the Soho Foundry and where the first gas-lit cottages were made by William Murdoch of the Golden Boys in Birmingham Centenary Square. Indeed. But sadly, William Hipkiss perished on the Titanic, and that deal was never done. So and Avery continued to be a British-owned company and not part owned by the Americans until fairly recently, when an American company called Waitronics took over part of Avery's, and now the company's called Avery Waitronics. That's all I wanted to say.
No, that's interesting. Well, there's all sorts of stories associated with the Titanic and the Black Country. Clearly, if you go by mine, not all of them true, but obviously yours is, because you've.
Well, no, Andrew Land's written a book on it, so.
Well, yeah, he
I
went.
think, he's on
down
the
with the ship.
passenger list as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
William
yeah.
Hipkiss.
The evidence is there. Yes, yeah, indeed.
Anyway, back to my granddad, Arthur Lewis Augustus Joseph Merriman, 2nd of March 1899, 8th of July 1971. Soldier, silversmith, and fireman. This is a photograph of my grandfather, Arthur Lewis Augustus Joseph Merriman, as I say, a name to go to bed with. There we go. There he is, Arthur, or Arch, as the family knew him, who is there dressed in his auxiliary fire service uniform in about 1940 at the Cape Hill Brewery in Smethwick, where he was a member of the fire brigade and was on fire watch in Smethwick, Winston Green, Cape Hill, Bearwood and Ladywood, putting out the fires from incendiaries which the Germans had dropped over those areas, being heavily industrialised and making lots of war material. Anyway, Arthur has quite an interesting history before those days as an auxiliary fireman at Cape Hill's fire station. In 1899, as I say, March 1899, 2nd of March 1899, he was born illegitimately to a farm labourer's family called the Merrimans in Chipping Campden on the Gloucestershire-Warwickshire border, which we visited and actually seen his family home, the Merriman Cottage, in Chipping Campden in Sheep Street, I think it is. And he shot rabbits on farms and in fields with his trusty 22 rifle before the Great War. But he also managed to get a silversmithing apprenticeship with Ashby Silver in Camden, in Chipping Campden, because they'd taken up a lot of redundant and empty workshop buildings in Chipping Campden, and they'd set up a silversmithing firm in Camden. And he was lucky enough, before the Great War, to get a silversmithing apprenticeship in about 1912, 13, something like that, when he was about 14 and leaving school, or earlier than that if they left school at 12. Bearing in mind he was born in 1899, so he'd be 13 in 1912. And but after a while, he decided to try his luck in Birmingham's jewellery quarter and joined a firm as an apprentice silversmith there called Eccleston and Hart, which still existed up until the 1950s and 60s, I think. Anyway, he was a silversmith apprentice there, but in the rush to war, in the early not there's a noise happening, Chris.
I'm trying to get rid of it. I've done it, I think.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. Anyway, he decided to sign up.
It's something to do with Keith Hodgkin's microphone.
Sorry?
It's something to do with Keith Hodgkin's microphone.
Okay.
I'm just telling Keith that one.
No problem. Anyway, he signed up in 1915 when he was 16 with the Royal Warwickshires. Did some training in Birmingham, where the Royal Warwickshire headquarters were headquartered, and went along over to France, 1915-16. I'm not sure. He can't have been there for the Somme. I don't think he fought on the Somme in 1916, July 1916. But certainly he fought at the Battle of Arras in 1917, which the film 1917, I gather, is about. And it's a marvellous film, which I must see, but I haven't seen it yet, which chronicles a day in the Battle of Arras, or A Day in a Battle in 1917, which was about the time when the first major tank battles were happening at Cambrai, and other battles were happening. Tank battles were starting to happen 1917. England had an advantage in tanks. My thesis for my degree was on tanks in the Great War, and the Germans were well behind on the tank engineering front and the armaments and the armour of the tanks. Britain was far ahead, and if you ever visit Bollington Tank Museum, you'll see the mother tank, very first one from 1916, with the wheel at the back like a gun carriage, and that was the very first tank. And then we adopted the lozenge-shaped tank, many of which were built at Smethwick Carriage Works, and there are pictures of the tank production line in the Quarter Request pub in Albury opposite the council house, which you can see in there, and marvel at the production line they had for tanks in those days in 1915, 16, 18, 17, 18. And so at the Battle of Arras, Grandad was gassed and was demobilised from the front. He was gassed. I'm not sure whether it was chlorine gas or mustard gas, but he certainly was bad enough to incapacitate him and make sure he was sent home from the front. And he then returned to Birmingham, where he lived in back-to-back housing in Dugdale Street off Dudley Road, Winston Green, next to the Mills bomb factory, which is where Birmingham was the place where the Mills bomb was invented, and the factory was in Dugdale Street in Winston Green. I have a feeling he may have worked in the Mills bomb factory for a while after being demobilised, certainly possibly until the war ended. And at around 1922, he met my grandmother, Gwendolyn Alice Langley. She was also illegitimate, and she came from Chipping, Little Cumberton near Ashton under Hill near Pershaw in Worcestershire. So Arthur was from Warwickshire, Gloucestershire. My grand Gwen was from Worcestershire near Pershaw in the Vale of Evesham. They got married in 1922. My uncle Edgar, who fought at Anzio in the Second World War, was born in 1922, soon after they were married. Whether he was born under the brush, I'm not sure, as the phrase goes in the Black Country. But certainly he was the issue when they married in 1922. They continued to live in the back-to-back housing in Dugdale Street, and Grandad continued to work as a driver and bodyguard for Mr. Eccleston at Eccleston and Hart Jewellers, where he'd worked before the Great War, going forward, because he'd learned to drive in the Great War. So this made him useful to Mr. Eccleston, who owned the business, for Arthur to drive Mr. Eccleston around the country, selling his bespoke jewellery to the rich and those that could afford it. And so Arthur did that for a few years. Then in about 1928, 1929, at the height of the Great Depression, when I was feeling he may have been laid off by Eccleston and Hart because nobody was buying jewellery because it was too expensive for people to buy anymore with the great crash. And then he got a job at the company he called Nettlefolds, which to all and sundry is known as GKN, or Guestkeen and Nettlefolds. And of course, this was Joseph Chamberlain's company, where Joseph Chamberlain, the father of Birmingham, had made all his money, which enabled his political career, and for him to become Lord Mayor of Birmingham in 1889 and create Birmingham as a city, the city of 1,000 trades and the workshop of the world. And Nettlefolds was Joseph Chamberlain's company, because Chamberlain was a Londoner. He wasn't a Brummie at all, but he made his money in Birmingham and his political reputation in Birmingham as Lord Mayor in 1889 and turning Birmingham into a city, the best governed city in the empire, according to him. But then he had a ricket with the Boer War, and 40,000 South African black men and women died in our concentration camps just after the Boer War. So that wasn't a great advertisement for the British Empire. And he, as you can see, the British invented concentration camps not the Germans or the Nazis or anybody else. It was the British. Anyway, I digress. Arthur worked for GKN, or Nettlefolds as he knew them, for many years. And my mom, his daughter, Dorothy Angela Merriman, who married my dad, Leslie Charles Bracey, in 1953, 52, 53, when the coronation was on, because I've got a big album of lads' photographs of Portsmouth Harbour with lots of ships from the Second World War still anchored there. And they married in 1952, 53. I can't remember exactly when. Might be 52 coronation year, I'm not sure. But I was the issue. I was born in 1958, April Fool's Day, 1958. And Mom at the time worked at the Midland Red in Bearwood, in Rutland Road in Bearwood, where it had its head office. And Mom had joined, they'd moved up from the Dugdale Street in the back-to-back housing about 1935, 36, something like that, and bought a house at 71 Poplar Road in Smethwick from Pip Jones, a prominent local businessman, Freemason, and more widely known as Anne Jones, the 1969 Wimbledon tennis champion husband. And my granddad bought this house. Arthur Lewis bought this house from Pip Jones, who later on, would you believe, became chairman of my rugby club, Dixonians Rugby Football Club, the old boys of George Dixon Grammar School for Boys in City Road in Edgbaston, where both I and Pip Jones went. And Pip was president and chair of the Dixonians for many years before, when they played out at Wassell Grove in Hagley. When I started playing for them in 1975 when I was 17, but their glory years were a bit before my time and during my time, actually. We won 3 North Midlands Cups in the 1970s, but sadly the club doesn't exist anymore. We had our centenary in 2013 and 5 High Court judges are in attendance of that day, as George Dixon Grammar School for Boys was classed as the second, possibly the second highly ranked grammar school in Birmingham.
Keith, could you get on a bit, please, because we're going to run out of time soon.
Okay, after King Edward School in Birmingham. Anyway, Arthur died in 1971, on the 8th of July 1971. He smoked 60 woodbines a day for the whole of his life after being gassed in the Great War at Arras in 17. And he's buried in the Roman Catholic plot at Quinton Cemetery in Birmingham, next to the love of his life, his wife Gwen, my grandmother Gwendolyn Alice, my auntie Maureen, his daughter, and my mom Dorothy Angela Bracey. Thank you very much.
Just one of many really interesting lives, I think. Now I'm trying to see if I can see the chat. Are there any things in chat there for Keith? I can't see anything.
No worries,
Very
Chris.
interesting from Donna Wilkinson. Donna Wilkinson Juskowski. Donna, we'll hear about later. Andrew?
Yeah, I seem to recall that in 1922, I think it was, a tank was presented to Tipton Council or to Hickman Park, but it was certainly displayed in Hickman Park. But it only lasted 2 years because Tipton Council then sold it for scrap. I don't know whether you've heard that one or whether you came across it when you were doing your research.
I mean, as I say, when I was doing my research for my thesis on tanks in the Great War, after the Great War, tanks were used as a rallying point and a way of collecting funds for the Royal British Legion. And they'd come to every town. I'm sure they came to Smethwick. There must be photographs at Smethwick Heritage Centre, where, as I say, I'm a volunteer, of the tank on the Smethwick War Memorial before it was put up. You know, the War Memorial next to where we are, next to between the Council House and Victoria Park Lodge, if you're familiar with Smethwick High Street, opposite the Red Cow pub, to really put it on its place. Anyway, they used tanks to raise money for post-war bonds and stuff like that.
I remember seeing a photo. I'm not quite sure the location. It might be in Bridal Hill or Dudley, or it would have been, because that's where I'm from, of a parade, post-war parade, with a tank going through
That's
as
right.
part of the soldiers' parade, which would
Yes.
have done wonders for the roads, wouldn't it? But yeah.
Great. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you. So the next one is I didn't see Michael Coley-Smith come online. Michael, if you're there, could you unmute yourself and show yourself, please? Um, are you there, Michael? No.
Yes.
No. Sorry.
Can you
You
hear me
there?
now?
Yeah, I
Okay.
can hear you. Can't see you.
Ah,
Do you want to show yourself and then people can see you? You don't have to, but if
yes. I'm not
you
sure
just
what I
turn your video
do.
on.
Not sure what I do in order to be seen.
Hold on, things are slightly out of order here. Hold on.
I think
Oh, I'm ever so sorry. I've jumped, haven't I? Michael, I'm meant to be having Donna next rather than you.
yes, of course.
I'm sorry, that's absolutely my fault.
No problem.
I'm just reading the wrong thing. Now,
No
Donna,
problem. I'm happy to wait, and I'll mute
come back in a bit, Michael.
Yep.
Donna, I know you're there. I've seen you. Donna, tell folk where you are, because I think you're one of our most far-flung customers, so to speak.
Yes, I live in the United States in a state called Delaware, which is just south of Pennsylvania, actually. So,
Thank you, Donna. I've got your slides, so you just tell me when you want me to change slide.
okay. So my name is Donna. My maiden name was Donna Wilkinson. It's now Josephowski. And I live in the States. But my grandfather was from Oldbury, and he came to the States as a young adult. So that's how my family ended up here. But I still have family back in the area. So I visit usually about every 3 years or so. This story is about my second great grandfather, on my grandfather's side, of course, and how he died in a workhouse at the West Bromwich workhouse. So, go ahead. I've had a fascination with the workhouses for about probably 10 years. I've been to probably at least 3 presentations in England on the workhouse, and I've had several books about them. And I was fascinated when I found out my own second great grandfather died in a workhouse. So I got really interested in how they came to be and how people ended up there. And this is a photo of the West Bromwich workhouse at one point. Go ahead. So anyway, my great great grandfather Richard Wilkinson was born in 1820 in Oldbury. This is his baptismal record, actually, but it's hard to read. But that's him with his parents, Joseph and Elizabeth. And his father was a coal miner. And you can go to the next slide. Thanks. Richard was baptized what was called the Oldbury Chapel, or St. Nicholas. I've heard it referred to. I didn't know about it until recently, but it was, I guess, located in the marketplace at one point in Oldbury, and then later Christ Church was built where that is today. And apparently the bell, excuse me. Oh, the bell from the chapel was placed in Christ Church, so it's one of the bells there. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just a little bit of background about Richard and where he lived. In 1820, of course, he was in Oldbury. I don't know where exactly. I'm not sure about 1831, but in 1841, he lived in Collier's Row, 1851, Meeting Street, 1861, Houzowen Street, 1871, Stony Lane, 18 Stone Street. 1882, he lived on Lodge Street at some point, but then by 1882, he was at the West Bromwich workhouse and he died there. Next slide, please. Just a little bit get a background about him. He was a coal miner throughout his entire life, and his family was too. My grandfather also down the line was also a coal miner. Next slide. Richard was married twice, first to an Elizabeth. I don't know her last name, but they were in this 1841 census. And then he married Caroline Jeffries, and they had the following children: Marianne, Richard, Maria, Joseph, John Benjamin, that was my great grandfather, and Edward. They were married at All Saints Church in West Bromwich. And his wife also, Caroline, died of tuberculosis in 1864. By also in 1871, just a note where he lived with his sons Richard and John. At that point, 1881, he was a boarder with the James and Emma Evans. He was still listed as a coal miner. And then in 1882, he died. Next slide. So, oh, I forgot something. Sorry, just a tidbit about Richard. I haven't proven this, but I'm pretty sure. In the British newspaper archives, I found a newspaper article, just a little bit about him. He was it says there was Richard Wilkinson of Church Street at that point, who was a coal miner who was charged with deserting the 33rd Regiment afoot, so, and also obtaining 1 shilling under false pretenses. So that was sort of interesting. I thought he was committed to jail for 1 month and also hard labor. So, this slide again is again of the West Bromwich Union Workhouse, where he spent the last part of his life. I'm not sure how long he was there. Just between 1881 and 1882, he went there, and I think he went there because he was ill. Next slide, please. So some interesting facts about workhouses in general. Originally, this is what I've heard in some of the presentations, but I mean, I guess the religious, the churches and things would help take care of the poor, but at some point, I guess there was obviously people taking advantage. And so the government stepped in at some point and were trying to set some kind of, guidelines and things like that. There was originally, in 1735, West Bromwich had a workhouse on what is now St. Clement's Lane, and it was a former nail warehouse. And then in 1834, the Poor Law Act was passed, which basically ensured that the poor were housed in workhouses, clothed and fed. This is sort of the beginning of what is known as the workhouse. In 1837, West Bromwich Union Workhouse came to be on December 2nd. In 1857, a new workhouse was built on Hallam Street and could house 100 or 820 inmates. Next, and that's what they called them. They called them inmates. Sounds like prison, but the 1860s workhouses were they asked them to basically create separate infirmaries for those that were ill. In the 1880s, they were asked to basically employ trained nurses as opposed to older inmates that were just helping. They had basically just had people that were there to help nurse people, and then they did employ actual nursing staff. And poor non-residents could go to the infirmary now, not just people that lived in the workhouse. So again, I think my ancestor went there for medical care. Also, just an interesting fact, all meals were eaten in silence with the men, women, and children kept separate. Next slide. So classification of inmates, sort of interesting. They had the aged or the infirm men, the able-bodied men. Some places it's sort of contradictory. It says men and youth above 13. Then it says youth and boys above or from 7 to under 16. Aged or infirm women, able-bodied women, and girls above 16, girls from above 7 to under 16, and then girls under 7 years. Next slide. And this was supposed to be a typical, I've seen different variations on it, but typical schedule at a workhouse, at least for those who are not in the infirmary. So rise at 6, you can read this, 6:30 to 7, breakfast, and so forth. So it was a pretty regimented schedule. Next slide. The West Bromwich Workhouse Infirmary still stands. And I think my cousin's wife, who's a nurse, said this, verified this. It was used as part of the Sandwell, I guess, administrative offices for the hospital. So I think this is the picture of the right building, but this is one of them. And so some of the buildings are still in existence today. Next slide. This is a photo of my great-great-grandfather's death certificate. He died of pneumonia, which, probably from due to being a coal miner, I'm sure as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, yeah, I mean, or whatever, whatever else they would have. There was no records available for the workhouse for West Bromwich. Again, in this record, even though he's listed at the West Bromwich workhouse, his address was listed on here as Lodge Street. So just an interesting fact too, that the workhouse had a burial ground, but he was not buried there. So I'm assuming they, obviously there was some money. They buried him at Root End Cemetery outside of Oldbury / Smethwick. Next slide, please. That's a picture of Root End Cemetery. Obviously, there's no grave remains for him, but that's where he's buried. Next slide, please. Just just little information. There's like this West Bromwich Union Pauper Memorial, and there's apparently, I didn't put this on the slide, but there's also a pauper trail in West Bromwich. It's online. It's a walking trail, but so you go on your own. But it's at westbromwichhistory.com, and there's basically a walking tour to show some of the sites where the workhouse was. This memorial, things like that. Another website that I've used as well as Peter Higginbotham. He's like well-known, I guess, historian for workhouses, and there's a lot of interesting information. That's his website there as well. So that's the story of my great-great-grandfather and how he ended up in the workhouse. It's very interesting. The whole workhouse phenomena is very interesting. Here in the States, they don't usually call them workhouses. They were poorhouses or almshouses, but it's the same type of thing. And I know during the Victorian era in particular, or around that time period, it was very bad. Again, the theory was, at least in the talk I heard, that again, people were taking advantage, they thought. So they try to make the workhouses as bad as possible. And that era, especially, was known to be very, very horrible. So they try to discourage people from going there. But of course, people went because, like my ancestor, he needed medical treatment. He didn't have money. And so he went there to try to get some kind of medical treatment to help. Any questions?
Oh, thank you, Don. I think you're certainly right that around that time, workhouses were slowly becoming sort of old people's hospitals, really. And that sort of developed over the next half a century. There is a chat question. Keith Robinson. Keith's trying to sell his book. Donna, I wrote a book on the Wednesbury and West Bromwich workhouses, sold out, but Black Country T-shirt shop in Halesowen may have a copy.
Okay.
If you want me to put you in touch with Keith Robinson, Donna, could you send an email, and if Keith allows it, I'll send it on to him.
That'd be great.
Okay.
I'm coming over there in the fall as well. So, and I have family still not too far away. So.
You mean the autumn, of course, rather than fall.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, don't worry. Okay. Any more questions, folks?
Yes.
Jane McQuillan, do you think there was the same shame attached to the US poorhouses as there were to the workhouses?
I think so. I mean, I believe so. But I think you hear more about the British workhouses. I don't know why, maybe from books and things like that. But I still think it was definitely shame attached. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Okay, so I think if we move on now, and I believe it really is Michael Coley-Smith, and Michael's going to read us a couple of poems. Are you there, Michael?
Yes.
I'm ever so sorry for messing you about.
No problem.
Over to you.
No problem. I don't think you messed me about at all. Genuine mistake. Okay. Thanks for putting the cover of my book on screen. These are poems that I published finally in 2019, and they're poems I started to write after my father moved away from the Black Country, which would have been some 10 years or 15 years before. and they came kind of one by one over a period of some 10 to 15 years. Quite a number of poems in this book are poems about growing up in the Black Country in the 1940s. And Hasbury, on the outskirts of Halesowen, was where we lived. And the Clent Hills were very much a visible presence. And of course, the front cover of the book is part of the Clent Hills in snow, part of what we used to call a plantation, with the 4 stones at the top of Clent in the far distance. The poems that I'm going to read, 2 poems. One is called Steam Hammer, the other is called Ice Cream. And I hope that some of you will find that you have memories yourself, if you're old enough, which may match something of what these 2 poems deal with. First poem is called Steam Hammer, and it actually refers to the huge steel forging press at Walter Summers in Halesowen, which was very much a presence at that time. The sound that this huge steel press made was a sound that you could hear some miles distant, and it's a sound that I remember very, very, very vividly. The we in this particular poem refers to myself and my brother, my older brother. We in the 1940s we shared a bed and a bedroom. And okay, that's at least that will help you understand, I think, the poem and follow it. Okay, Steam Hammer. It was on still nights we could hear it, or when the wind was blowing from the east. Elephant hide drum, pum, pum, for the tappity-tap of our tom-toms. The troll beating time for the 3 billy goats. The giant smelling blood, his fee, foe, fum. Sometimes the wind was wayward and sucked the sound into the distance. We'd strain then at the silence. Shut up, we'd say, if either of us spoke. We both wanted to be first to hear it when the wind carried back the sound. Pum, pum. Those nights had many voices, screech owls crying from the woods, wind in winter throwing ice at the window, the sirens wail, bombers droning high overhead, and that reassuring pum, pum, that told of men shaping steel with steel. The second poem is called Ice Cream, and the place it refers to, Sturmer's, was our local grocery shop. So, ice cream. We heard the cries, ice cream at Sturmer's. Soon, a crowd of us stood at the shop door, the door resolutely closed. Mr. Sturmer's lunch hour going on and on. Open up, you old bugger, someone shouted, but the shop stayed empty. Promptly, at 2 o'clock, Mr. Sturmer appeared, fastening his white coat. Ignoring us, He leaned into the refrigerator, then decisively closed the lid. At the door, he glared at us. Unbolting it top and bottom, he opened it a crack. "It ain't frozen. You'll have to go home and get cups." What's he say? "It ain't frozen." We stood bereft, then turned and ran. "And bring a spoon with you," Mr. Sturmer yelled. Back with our cups, Mr. Sturmer dipped his scoop, high priest doling out sacred stuff. There on the pavement, we spooned it up. Vanilla, cold, creamy, honey sweet on our tongues. It was everything we'd learned to long for, to crave, everything the war had carried off. We didn't care that it was liquid. It was ice cream. We believed in it. We wanted more. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Michael. That's wonderful. Thank you. Are there any comments on that? No, I can't see anything coming on chat.
Yes, I enjoyed them.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, whoever said that. Thank you. So we move on, and we move on to Ward Jones, who began the evening. Ward is going to tell us a bit about his early life. Sundays was for church. Ward.
Thank you. I want to take you to a village on the southwest edge of the back country. In 1950, I was born in the
Ward,
local...
could you put your video on?
Oh.
Is the chap who did the corner.
That's it. That's it.
So I want to take you to a little village on the edge of the Black Country in the southwest corner. I was born there in 1950 and lived the first 21 years of my life there. Now, where do I get to my next slide?
I do it for you. So
okay,
Chris,
next slide,
you
please.
move on.
Yeah. Sorry, folks. Next
Okay.
slide.
Chris.
And here's the focal point of many of my days when I wasn't at home or at school or at college in those 21 years. Next slide. There's the church in the middle of the picture. It was actually built in 1906. It succeeded another building that was on the same site, built in 1854. So it only lasted for just over 50 years. And before that, they would meet in a couple of ramshackle buildings. And before that, when they were thrown out of the other Methodist church was in the village, they used 3 pubs to meet together. So it had a fascinating history. If you see the building alongside it, sorry, that's the Sunday school building, which survived until the early 1970s. It had been built in 1850, and it was a hub of activity. Next slide, please. This was Sunday for most people in the village. There was a multiplicity of churches and chapels in the locality, all within spitting distance of one another. And in my later years, in terms of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, this was the sort of pattern that one experienced. And if you didn't go to church, you probably stayed at home or kept your head down. It was unbelievably quiet, despite the fact that where that picture was showing the centre of the village, you could look around and you could see a post office, you could see a doctor's surgery, you could see a TV shop, a wool shop, a butcher's, a sweet shop, but they were all closed. And nobody was interested in going in. Well, they probably would have liked to go into them. So you'd go to Sunday school at 10 o'clock. You'd then go into the first quarter of an hour of the morning service. You would appear back again in the afternoon at Sunday school, which was still in the 1950s and 60s, being run on very traditional lines. There was a superintendent and there was a desk in the middle, and everybody sat there. We'd have a very short service. Then we'd go into our classes. Then we'd come out of our classes and close with a mini service again. And you'd be expected to go to the evening service at 6 o'clock. When we were in our teenage years, we'd go off to one of the other local churches where all the young people would gather for the after meeting. So you'd want to go to school or college on Monday morning to recover from this excess of religiosity. Next, please. On a Sunday morning, after we'd been in Sunday school and we went into church for about 15 minutes or so, as we went out, we would be given one of these stamps. They had a biblical picture and a text on them. We were given an album in which to stick these little stamps, and at the end of the year, we'd hand in our album, and if we got enough stamps, we would be the beneficiaries of our prizes that we took home and smiled about. Next, please. We also got prizes for attendance in Sunday afternoon school. On one occasion, I must have been about 10 or 11, I think, I was given a copy of The Water Babies, and I felt incredibly insulted when I was given this particular book. I thought this was far too childish, and I complained, and I went and saw the Sunday school secretary and said, please, can I change my book? And I've been an awkward so-and-so ever since. They did change it, so I was very pleased about that. Next, please. I've been doing some research because I'm writing a history of the church at the moment, and I simply put this in to show you the decline of the Sunday school over the years. They're incomplete statistics because I can't find the information for where those gaps are, but there you see, well over 600 in the 1920s, which I think was really the sort of high point of Sunday school attendance in the 20th century. And then you see it gradually decline, and by 1998 there are 24 in the morning and 8 in the afternoon, and it was in 1998 that they decided to close down the afternoon Sunday school. Next, please. This is not part of my story because it actually goes back to the 1920s, but I thought it was so interesting I had to include it. For the evening services in church, evidently in those days the young people did attend the service, and what the church authorities decided to do was have groups of adults to sit with the young people, the officers of order, and they were expected to keep them in order. It would have been a fascinating experience to say the least, I'm sure, but there it was. They were given their responsibilities and they had to keep things okay. I'm not sure when that faded out. I think probably when we came to the Second World War, and I certainly never had any experience of it. But there we are. If you grew up in the 1920s, you were kept in order. Some people might say they'd like the same thing today, but that's another thing. The highlight of the year for many years was the Sunday school anniversary. And here is a picture from the mid-1950s of the Sunday school anniversary. There are 69 young people in that photograph. And it kept going in a similar sort of pattern through well into the 70s, and I think probably into the 80s as well. But you were expected girls to wear white dresses, boys to wear white shirts, and I think it was maroon ties. And if you were in the children's choir for the anniversary, you would get a special treat because of your attendance. The platform at the front with the littlest ones on was bought early in the 20th century. It was removable. They'd put it up and take it down before and after the anniversary. Next slide, please. In those days, through until certainly the 1970s, they would print handbills advertising who was going to be the preacher. There'd be a morning, afternoon, and evening service with songs by the young people. They would bring ministers in from all over the country through certainly the first 3 quarters of the 20th century. And back before that in the 19th century. They would have A3 posters which people were supposed to take home with them and put in their front windows to advertise the anniversary. Next slide, please. And instead of hymn books, they would print leaflets with all the hymns on and all the items that the young people were going to do. So there'd be lots of songs by the young people. They would be supported by the choir, who had to quit their choir stalls for the anniversary. And a month later, there'd be another 3 services for the repetition. And then the same thing happened again. And the church would be absolutely packed out. I remember in the 1960s, it was common practice to invite certain individuals, usually men, to take up the collection. The idea being that it was a real privilege and honour to be invited to take up the collection, certainly in the evening service. And they take the collection just before the last hymn. While the last hymn was being sung, the trustees would go into the vestry, they'd count the money, and somebody would say, Lake Street up the road, they had their anniversary the other week, how much did they make? And if the collection hadn't amounted to whatever Lake Street had made, the trustees would be standing there throwing in £5 notes until the collection had gone past what was being collected by its rivals. Next, please. Blackpool. What's Blackpool got to do with it? Well, I said the Sunday school anniversary had a treat for the children, and there would be an annual trip where they might go as far as Blackpool or Rhyl or somewhere like that. And I remember going to Trentham Gardens on one occasion and slipping in the paddling pool and having to walk around all day in soaking wet clothes, but that's another story. Next, please. We're winding down now. One of the things that the Sunday school had to join in every year was the annual procession of witness, when the 5 local Methodist churches would all gather together at one of the churches. The procession on this occasion, 1950, just a month after I'd been born, was to assemble at Five Ways Church at 210, facing Ruiton Street. It was very well organised. And if we go on to the next slide, please, you can see what happened. They'd walk along to a particular point in the village. They'd sing a hymn, or having walked along, somebody would give an address. And I was never quite sure why we were doing this. I mean, I know why in theory we're doing it, but not too many people came out to take an interest in what we were doing. I think they all shut their doors and in some cases drew the curtains. But it was intended to be a procession of witness. Another example of how so much of what we did was tied up with the church, and that's where the story ends today.
Thank you, Ward. There are just so many nuances there that I can remember only too well. I have to say my high point was getting 100 out of 104 attendance points for Sunday morning and afternoon.
I never quite got
really
that
pleased
far.
with that one. Anyway, are there any other comments, folks, there?
Yeah, I went to a Methodist Sunday school when I was little in Stourbridge, and I remember the outings every year, but it certainly wasn't Blackpool or anything like that. We used to go to Clent on the Sharabang, and that's the only outings I ever remember. Clent on the Sharabang as the Sunday school outing.
Before sort of before the Second World War, they very often would sort of go to a local farmer's field or something like that. As people became a bit more affluent, I suppose, they start to spend money, and they spend quite a bit of money on buying prizes and taking the young people on their outings.
There's a question for you, Ward. This is an interesting one. Have you carried on with church? Did it affect your life?
Well, you know the answer to that one.
I know the answer to that one, mate. Yeah.
In 2015, I retired as a Methodist minister after 40 odd years. The last 17 of which I looked after some 250 churches in the west of England. But that's a fascinating story in itself. And my life at the sorry, I was going to say my life at the moment is preoccupied by trying to get my garden up together for the summer and finish off a history of Zor Church, which sadly closed last year. But we're hoping to have a celebration in the autumn to remember the 200 years of work, because it's a massive building in the middle of the village. It dominates the centre of the village, and I thought it couldn't just disappear.
Keith Brace is waving his hand. Unmute yourself, Keith, please. No? Well, Keith's trying. Donna.
I've got it.
Okay, go on.
Ward, I went to Sandon Road Methodist Church, which is in Bearwood, in Barnsley Road in Bearwood, which is in an arts and crafts conservation area. And I was in junior church till I was 16, from the age of 4 till I was 16. We never had scouts and guides and any of that sort of thing. We had the Boys Brigade, who'd march up and down Sandon Road from the church to the Bear Hotel, up and down in formation, playing their bugles, their drums, and all that sort of thing. But my mum and dad said to me, right, the age of 16, make your own mind up, go to church if you want. If you don't bother anymore. So at the age of 16, I never darkened their door again. Well, I do remember dressing up as a pirate on a stage, because we had a lovely church still there. It's a conservation area, I think, as I say. I'm not sure when it was built. It looks like Victorian. I don't think it's arts and crafts. It may well be. I'm not sure. The church is still there, but now run by an Ethiopian Christian church, and they've knocked the guts out the inside of it. But at least it's still being used as a church.
Yeah.
Anyway, we must move on. Donna in Delaware says, fascinating. My family is Methodist as well. Just before we began, Ward told me his preaching career isn't finished, and at the start of his sermon yesterday, somebody fainted and had to be removed. Well, it was Pentecost, wasn't it, I guess? But we'll move on to one I'm going to read. But sorry, Andrew is now chairing, but this one I'm going to do. Andrew, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. So we're carrying on the ecclesiastical theme here, with members of Bishop Milner Catholic Secondary School, which have been provided by Mary Rowlands, but presented by Chris.
Yeah, Mary sent me just a few thoughts about the Bishop Milner Catholic Secondary School. I think Marie must be one of our older, if not the oldest member that we have. She's 92, and she doesn't actually feel really up to actually talking herself, so she's asked me to do it. And I've looked up a few pictures on the Bishop Milner old pupil site as well. So just a couple of minutes on this. There's a picture of Bishop Milner School in the 1970s there. But Marie writes, when Bishop Milner Catholic Secondary School was opened about 1963, I was for a short time deputy head. We drew the older children from the former all-age Catholic schools of Briar Hill, Sedgley and Dudley, At that time, the accents of each village were still very different from each other, and there was within each much repetition of surnames, as Andrew Barnsley, the local historian, knew well. I'd really value comment on that, because I knew there was a bit of difference, but I never realised accent differences were so marked across the Black Country villages. And here's a couple of things actually from Marie's, the time Marie was there, or around about that time. Bishop Milner's School were doing Arsenic and Old Lace as a play. And you can see there the sports day, results, or who took part in each event. And it being a Catholic school, I guess these are the names of houses at the top. The houses were Lourdes and Carmel, which wonderful. I believe in my school it was named after hills, so that was rather more prestigious. And then Marie writes of other schools. St Mary's Briar Hill School was in a single room with a stove in the middle. I did go there once and was struck by the heat. The formidable Miss de Breu taught at one end and was a head teacher. Her assistant was the diminutive Miss Hildreth, who came to school from Wolverhampton on her motorbike, and the Dudley School had 2 nuns. A different world from Methodism there, I think. So they're just a few thoughts from Marie. And Glenys is just giving her apologies as she's leaving. So there, and then that brings us to the next one. Andrew?
Yes, I believe it's Keith Hodgkins now.
No.
I've You're right, Chris. Yes, repeated what you did earlier. Yeah. So we're now. That's an intriguing title. A Dudley Childhood and a Rolls Royce from Jane McQuillan.
Oh, thank you.
Shouldn't that be a Dudley Childhood and a Bean? I wonder, but we'll find out. Thank you, Jane.
Right. These are. I don't have a photograph of the Rolls Royce, but if you just think of Al Capone with the running boards and the doors that open forwards and so on, that's just about the size of it. And my dad was very keen on this sort of thing. So just as we moved from Dudley in 1957, we were living in a council house in Warrens Hall Road. And just as we left, he bought this Rolls Royce, which was 1928, I think. It was a straight 6 Rolls Royce with a 3-litre engine. And for a few months, it was parked outside the council house. And even at the time, I thought how incongruous this was. And I think most people did. And I'd love to hear if anyone else was living in Warrens Hall Road in 1957. I'd love to hear if you remember it, because I don't believe there's ever been a Rolls Royce there before or since. And I remember we moved to Kings Winford, and we took it up to the Pensnet weighbridge and had it weighed on the weighbridge. It was 2 tons. And that was our family car for about 8 years. So that was a lot of fun driving around in the old Rolls. It got quite a lot of attention. And whenever Dad parked it, he unscrewed the Flying Lady, which was solid silver. It was also the radiator cap, because of course he knew someone might pinch it, so he wasn't going to have that, was he? So that's the Rolls Royce of the Dudley childhood, just for a few years, I have to say. And I've got another couple of anecdotes I'd like to share. One of the primary schools I went to, it was an infant school. I was at Cates Hill, and they were still using slates. And I don't know anybody else who used a slate at school, but try telling that to your grandchildren, and they just look at you as if it's Stone Ages. They don't even know what it is, so you have to describe it to them. And I remember scrawling on it, and you had your own sponge and you rubbed it out. But when I think about it, it was very eco-friendly, rather than using up all that paper. So that was Cates Hill in the 1950s in Dudley. I don't even know if the school is still there. And my final memory, this is just a brief entry. We now live in Ulverston in southwest Cumbria. So it's straight up the M6 to junction 36 and turn left, and you eventually come to Ulverston. And there's some cut glass there, Cumbria Crystal. So we went to look around Cumbria Crystal, and instantly I heard a black country accent. And I said, "Where are you from?" "But Brawley Hill." "Well, how come you're here?" And what I didn't know until then was that the people who set up Cumbria Crystal in Ulverston had transported the skills of glassmakers from Brawley Hill and Stourbridge up into Cumbria in order to establish the company in Cumbria. And it's going to this day and doing very well. And it's one of the last places where they're still doing blown glass. If anyone comes up to Southwest Cumbria to Ulverston, you can do a factory tour and watch the people at work glass blowing. So there's lots more I could say, but I don't have any documents with me, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Jane. Absolutely
You're welcome.
fascinating. If anybody does fancy a go on a slate, Black Country Museum is the place. St James's School from Dudley, and you can have a go on a slate in there. You can also experience a very strict Edwardian lesson. Anybody got any comments or questions for Jane?
There's one on chat, Andrew.
Oh, is there? Oh, it's not on my chat. I don't know why.
Oh, well, I'll read it. It was from John Woodall. "I was living in Warrens Hall Road, but don't remember the Rolls Royce. I also started school at Cateshill, then Sketmore. So Cateshill's
Sledmere.
still there, but has moved."
All right. Yeah, I went to Sledmere as well. Yeah. I'm just wondering if we were at school together. Yeah.
John Woodall, the name is, Jane.
What year were you born? What year was John born? Could he answer?
I don't. I'll let you know if he does answer, Jane. Okay.
Yeah, there's nothing come up on the chat as
Yeah.
yet.
Yeah. Right.
Did you get that, John? What year were you there? If you could drop it into the chat, I'll pass it on to Jane. The comments appeared now. I don't know why it didn't appear before. No. Oh, there we go. 1947.
You're muted, Jane.
You're still there, Jane?
Yeah, that surprises me because Sledmere didn't open till the 1950s, the mid 1950s. Right. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, that was 1957, the Rolls Royce in Warrens Hall Road.
Right.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much, Jane. So now, hopefully correctly, it's Keith Hodgkins. And Keith's going to talk to us about Dudley Port in 1962. Over to you, Keith.
Unmute, Keith.
Oh, is that it?
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
There now.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for that. Yeah, this is a photograph, 1962, looking from Dudley Port northwards. You can see Dudley Castle Hill in the distance, and the significance of this for me is that this was my train spotting spot in the early 1960s. The railway is the South Staffordshire line coming down from Dudley to Walsall, and that 2-car diesel train is a Dudley to Walsall train, it's just slowing down as it approaches Dudley Port low level station. And behind the photographer is the high level line, which is the main line between Birmingham New Street and Wolverhampton High Level, which is still the main line today. So from this spot here, which is actually on the canal side, because I'm standing on the canal towpath where the canal goes over the South Staffordshire Railway. So you've got the canal interest as well at that spot. So it was a good position. And what's interesting to us now is that this railway line, although it closed to passengers as long ago as 1964, the freight struggled on until 1994, when the freight finished, and that the railway line has been mothballed ever since then. Because it was always planned that there'd be another line of the metro, and that's actually under construction at last, many years after it was originally mooted, but work is actually progressing now to convert that line to the latest route for the metro trams, which will come up from Wednesbury up to Dudley, and eventually down to Merry Hill. And they're still saying that it'll be open by the end of this year, but I'm beginning to doubt that, because there's so much more work to do. I think it'll be well into next year by the time it opens. But anyway, work is carrying on apace at the moment, and it'll be very exciting to travel on the metro when it does open. Incidentally, for any railway enthusiasts amongst you, the photographer is a chap called Michael Mensing, he's a well-known name in railway photography in the 50s and 60s, and he's a chap who lived on the other side of Brummagem, so he did take quite a lot in the Black Country. He did come over to the Black Country quite a bit, and he took some wonderful pictures around here. Now, if we look at the picture, there are two or three things of great interest. Well, for me, and on a Black Country scale as well. If you look at that, there's a chimney on the right-hand side of the picture in the distance, and that's the chimney of Palethorpe's factory, Palethorpe Sausage Factory, which existed there from about 1890 up until 1967, when it closed down and Palethorpe moved lock, stock and barrel to Market Drayton, to a new plant. That plant at Market Drayton is still active, actually, although Palethorpe's themselves have been taken over numerous times by big concerns, and that I don't think the name exists anymore. Although the plant at Market Drayton still got the address Palethorpe's House, which is nice. So the name Palethorpe's does live on in that sense. But the other thing about this picture is that you see there's a siding on the left-hand side of the railway going up with some railway wagons at the end of the siding, and a corrugated iron building just above that. And that was Palethorpe's siding, where they received the live pigs by train, would be shunted into that siding and offloaded, and then taken the quarter of a mile or so along the streets to the Palethorpe's sausage factory for processing. And likewise, the finished products, the sausages and pies, would be transported by road from the factory to that railway siding, where they'd be loaded onto vans for distribution throughout the country by train. And there was a fascinating system going on, whereby the Palethorpe's vans would be taken either up to Dudley to be attached to mainline trains at Dudley, or to be brought round to Dudley Port High Level to be attached to trains on the main line, usually going north. A lot of the products went north, particularly after the Second World War. And the other thing to point out is that on the right of the photograph, you can see another railway embankment, and that's what's known as the Sedgley Loop, and that connected the South Staffordshire Railway round on a loop to join the high level railway at Dudley Port. So vans could be shunted round that loop to join mainline trains at Dudley Port High Level. So there was a lot of interesting working going on. Now, I started train spotting in 1961, and this picture is 1962. But the other memory I've got of this area is, you see the open land to the right of the diesel train is occupied, or was occupied up till about this period, by allotments which were laid out during the Second World War, as so much railway land was in the Dig for Victory campaign. And my dad had an allotment on that site, and in fact I think that's his shed, you can see a little black square shed just to the left of the signal post, almost above the front of the train. I think that was my dad's shed, and I've got some lovely memories of going out to the allotment with my dad and helping him to dig the allotment in the 50s. Now I know that was before I started train spotting, and I was aware of the trains whizzing past and my dad telling me where they were going. But I wasn't actually taking numbers back then, sadly. I wish I had have been at that young age to have been more aware, but I certainly remember the trains. And this the South Staffs line was heavily used by freight at that time, particularly coal trains going up to Stourport power station. Very long coal trains, many of them being banked by an engine in the back as well, because this was quite a steep bank up to Dudley. So there'd be endless processions of coal trains going and going quite late into the evening as well. So I'd remember lying in bed listening to these, because I lived just on the other side of that, the embankment on the right, between that and the Palethorpes factory. So just in the distance there. So lots of lovely memories. And the other thing I remember was that there was a brook which flowed down along the tight to the railway line boundary. You can't quite see it on the picture. There's only a very narrow brook about a couple of feet wide, which is obviously water coming down off Castle Hill and Conigry and flowing down towards the River Tyne. And one of my jobs for me dad digging his allotment was to collect the water in a watering can from this brook to water the allotment. And what I do remember is that the colour of this water, it was this deep green, thick, sludgy water. So God knows what these the veg that my dad was growing in his allotment. But anyway, we survived to tell the tale. So. But I think that was typical of that time. All the water courses in the Black Country were so polluted. But there we were, happily watering Dad's allotment with it. And by the time of this photograph, those allotments were pretty well disused, and that land looks a bit untidy. I think the allotments had gone out of use by then. Certainly, I wasn't going to the allotment by the time I was train spotting. By the time I was 10 in 1961, so those memories sort of probably back into the 50s, and really just on the threshold of my memory, really. My dad used to tell me that the allotment started to go into decline when those council houses on the left of the picture were built, probably in the mid 50s. That's for anybody who knows the area. That's Jays Avenue is the street. And my dad used to say when those council houses were built, the folks in the council houses used to come out, jump across the railway, and nick the veg out the allotments, which killed off the allotments really in the mid 50s. So that was my dad's take on it anyway. So lots of nice memories in that picture. Oh, the other thing to tell you about is the pigs going to from the siding, arriving by train at the siding. They were then taken to the Palethorpes factory. Now, in my day, I've got very vivid memories of these pigs going in a trailer, which was pulled by a little. I think it would have been a Massey Harris tractor. I can picture it now with a high-sided trailer full of squealing pigs, and it was only about a quarter of a mile, but it passed the top of our street as it went round to the sausage factory. And of course, while this was going, this left a trail of pig muck all along the street, and it used to stink. And because of that, I've got that's quite a nostalgic smell for me now. The smell of pigs, which is curious. Remembering that little scene from childhood. But my parents and my grandparents used to tell me that before the war, the pigs were actually herded along the street. And there were all kinds of stories of pigs running up entries and getting lost and being herded around the place, and lots of fun going on with that. But in my memory, in the post-war era, in the 50s, they were being loaded onto this trailer, which went round the streets to the factory. So there we are. That's Dudley Port in 1962.
Thanks ever so much, Keith. I suppose the other one would be Marsh and Baxter's, wouldn't it? The two main ones, Marsh and Baxter's and Palethorpe's. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
I mean, you just sort of tied something up, Keith, really. There's a Jim William Jones poem called The Slaughterhouse, which talks about pigs being driven across the road. And knowing that he was basically a Coasley guy, or from that end of the world, it's probable that he was talking about Palethorpe's, I would think.
It could be. He doesn't actually identify it in that poem, does he?
No, he doesn't.
But
I didn't know that. I only knew the Marsh and Baxter's one before.
Yeah, in Marsh and Baxter's, I believe they were driven through a tunnel.
Yeah.
Which I think maybe still there.
Hello.
Yeah, maybe.
Hello. Hiya.
Hello.
Can I tell somebody something?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, my father-in-law, my late father-in-law, George Sherwood, worked at Palethorpe's as a fitter welder's mate from the late 40s until the 1950s. And he told many stories about Palethorpe's pie factory, and he would confirm that they came on a railway wagon. But the other story he used to tell was when they used to open the meat store in the morning when they all clocked on, they had about 6 or 7 Jack Russells dogs, which were belonged to the meat store managers and people who worked in there. When they opened the doors, they'd send the dogs in first, the Jack Russells in first, and they'd kill about 200 rats by biting the back of their necks and breaking their necks. And soon all the rats were lying all over the place. And that was a story he told. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But I would imagine it's not. It probably is true because George had some fanciful tales. But he also worked with Stan Plant, Robert Plant's uncle, the Led Zeppelin frontman, who worked at Palethorpe's with George, my father-in-law. And we knew Stan Plant and Robert Plant for years before Stan and Gwen, his wife, passed away in about 10 years ago.
Oh, thanks for that, Keith. I think our last presentation is going to be Chris again. Very seasonal because it's Christmas cards, calendars, and first aid covers. Over to you, Chris.
Yeah, I've been doing some work lately on the Black Country Society archives, and one person in particular has donated a lot of stuff to that, and that's Keith, who we've just heard from, who, as you can tell from his background, seems to have a library that's possibly the most extensive in the Black Country. And he had loads of stuff that he's donated to the archives. And many of these are now on the website and they'll be in the archives as well. And all I want to do is to just raise your attention to these so you can go and have a look yourself, really, because some of them are quite nice. First of all, there are Christmas cards. The Society, Black Country Society, published Christmas cards over 25, 30 years or whatever. And some of the covers are wonderful. I mean, I just give a couple here. There's one from 1968, a nativity card. They come 3 knowing chaps from a good way off. And we've got the 3 kings represented as men bringing their darts, their whippets, and their pigeons, which I think is theologically brilliant. And again, the star over a Black Country Yard by Austin Mosley there. Then there are pictures that look like this from either from sketches or from paintings. Again, lots of these. Do go and have a look. And again, a poem by Jim William Jones, and with a picture of the sportsman here with the staffy and the fighting cock. So you can tell what sort of sports he was involved in there. And more modern colour photos as we moved on into the 80s. There were some colour cards there as well. There are also a series by Kleebach, Charles Baker, no relation, of cartoon cards. And some of them are quite funny and some of them are a bit smutty, really, if you like that sort of thing. But the one on the right I particularly like there. man being comforted by his wife. And I could see it all, missus. Me prize bird leading the rest by 3 mile. Then he gets busted up by this ruddy sled flying over. A lovely one, a lovely one. But lots more there, so I just encourage you to go and have a look at them. There are also lots of calendars, and these calendars are an amazing resource of pictures. And you can see here from March 71 some sketches of Owen Street in Tipton and in Darlaston. April 82, some industrial photos there. And Keith has told me a lot of the pictures were from the Society Photo Archive there. And so these have all been digitized. Some old photos. Wednesbury Old Athletic, 1877. They were really quite an important football team in the area at the time. And, you know, if the world had been different, they might have been where Villa is now. You know, they were that sort of level. Think of it, Wednesbury in the Champions League. That would be something. But again, they're all there to have a look at. And again, different style pictures, photographs of Dudley, obviously, there in 2001. I should say that all of these are actually for members only. So they're password protected, so they're not widely available. But it's only £20 membership, should you wish to join. And if you're not a member, you can equally do so. The Society also issued in its early days first aid covers and medallions for various things, such as the Air of Maltby, the closure of the Elizabeth Blast Furnace, closure of Bagridge Colliery, and in 1979 to commemorate Agenoria on the Shut End or Kingswinford Railway. And that was 150th anniversary. I'm thinking more and more, and this is the first time I'm trying it on anyone, 2029 will be the 200th anniversary of Agenoria. I don't think that's something we ought to let pass. I really don't. I think we ought to be doing something on that. And perhaps even now we need to start to be thinking about it. If anyone's interested, get back to me, because I'm beginning to think about it a bit. But that's it. I really didn't want to say very much, but there's an awful lot of stuff there, thanks to Keith. And we've also digitized some of the older histories and put them into members only areas on the website. So again, do have a look at that. And the next step, and this is going to be the big one, again with Keith's help, is to try to get the Society Photographic Archive digitized, or at least as much of it as we can. And that is a huge task that's really quite daunting. But that's, I think, where we are. And I think I'll stop share there, Andrew, because that's all I've got to say, really.
Thanks very much, Chris. Bit of a shame, I think, that Agenoria is lodged up in York Railway Museum and not down here with us. But there we go. We're sort of well out of time. But is there anybody who'd come prepared with I've got to say, short piece that they wanted to share that they hadn't mentioned to Chris? And so we are well out of time. No, well, it leaves me to obviously thank everybody for this evening. I think we've had a great evening. We've just had a message pop up. Many thanks to everyone who gave presentations, all very interesting. And one or two more coming in. John Ashby, thank you so much. As was mentioned at the start, this is the last of the virtual heritage meetings, but not the last forevermore. Last for the summer. Our next virtual heritage meeting is going to be in September. Everybody who's logged on tonight will automatically get the email from Chris about the September one. I can't remember off the top of my head what September is, but
Chris. It's Simon Briarcliffe from the Black Country Living Museum about the Irish in Wolverhampton.
Ah, well, there we go. So that will be in September. I'll say you'll all get a free invite to that. We've had some more messages coming through. Donna, thank you, and thank you for preserving history. And Ned, hello Ned. Ned says great stuff. Ned Williams there, the author, of course, of I believe it's over 50 books. I'm not absolutely certain, Ned, but I believe it's either 50 or over 50. Say again, Ned.
52.
Ah, there we go. Oh, I was close. And Jane, ditto. Andrew Johnson, have a good summer all. Really enjoyed this evening. And Marion, very interesting meeting. So, as I said before, thank you very much to everyone concerned, and we'll say good night there.